All right, today we're talking about carbohydrates. And actually, before we talk about carbohydrates, we're just going to talk about what organic molecules are in general. So feel free to just title this carbohydrates. We're going to do a little bit of background first, and then we'll get into carbohydrates. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is what is an organic molecule? This whole unit's going to be about the molecules that we eat and what they do for our body. And so a lot of these molecules we eat are called organic molecules. They're molecules that come from living things. They have a lot of carbon and hydrogen. So by definition, an organic molecule has to have carbon and hydrogen. It can have extra stuff. It can have oxygen, phosphorus, nitrogen, but it has to have carbon and hydrogen. Usually these organic molecules come from living things. So when we're eating food, we're typically eating things that used to be living, whether they be plants, things like lettuce or carrots, or they might be coming from animals like fish or meat. All of those things used to be living. So living things are made up of these organic molecules called proteins, carbs, and lipids. So we eat them, but they also make up living things. We're also going to be talking about chemical formulas in this unit. A chemical formula just shows the number and type of atoms in a molecule. What's an atom? Something that comes from the periodic table, from an element. You may remember atoms from 8th grade or 6th grade. Protons, neutrons, and electrons. Atoms make up stuff. We have different types of atoms. We have hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms. So when I say chemical formula, the chemical formula is H2O. The name of that molecule is water. If I say, what's the chemical formula for glucose? You would tell me C6H12O6. It tells me here I've got 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So now that we have a little bit of the background for that, let's take a look at carbohydrates, because they're going to be the first organic molecule we're going to talk about. So you take a look at these pictures. We've got 1, 2, 3 different carbohydrates. And what letters do we see in all of them? We see C's, we see H's, and we see O's. So carbohydrates all have C's, H's, and O's. Typically they have a ratio of 1 for every 1 C, they've got 2 H's and 1 O. You might be looking at these pictures and saying, I don't really see very many C's in there. Well, that's because scientists took a shortcut. So in these pictures, at the vertices here, there are C's, but this is kind of a scientific shorthand where they didn't write all of the C's in there. And so we do see our H's and O's. We see some C's here. Generally, we have twice as many H's as we have C's and O's. So let's take a look. If I have these, we have to take a look and see which of these have the correct ratio. So if we look at this first one, remember our ratio is 1 to 2 to 1, meaning they have twice as many H's as they have C's and O's. Well, here they've got twice as many H's. They've got 12 instead of 6 here. 6 times 2 is 12. So this would be a carbohydrate. What do you think about this one? This one would not be a carbohydrate because it doesn't have twice as many H's as it has C's and O's. So we've got to check, are our C's and O's about the same? And do we have twice as many H's? Over here, hey, yeah, twice as many H's as we have C's and O's. Now this one, you might be like, oh, Miss Frankson, it's really close. It's got 11 here. As long as it's roughly about a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, we count it as a carbohydrate. So this would be a carbohydrate. So let's talk about what these carbohydrates are made out of. Okay, they're built out of hexagons. Hexagons are called monosaccharides. An example of a monosaccharide is glucose. Glucose is just one hexagon. Mono means one. So saccharide means sugar. So this just means one sugar, one hexagon. So we can have a carbohydrate that's one hexagon, but we can also have carbohydrates that are connected together made of lots of hexagons. So now let's talk about what these carbohydrates are used for. Scientists classify carbohydrates as simple or complex. So our simple carbohydrates, and I'm just going to change this really quick. All right, simple carbohydrates. Our simple carbohydrates are things like monosaccharides and disaccharides. They're only made of one hexagon or two hexagons. These are really sugary things, and they're used generally for really quick energy. If you think about what happens when a little kid eats a lot of sugar, sometimes we think about them getting really hyper. And then they might crash. So simple carbohydrates give us a lot of energy really quickly, but it goes away pretty quickly as well. So anything that tastes sugary has a lot of simple carbohydrates in it. We also have complex carbohydrates. These are things like polysaccharides and starch. Poly means many, so this would be many hexagons connected together. And starch is an example of a polysaccharide where there's lots of hexagons together. They're used for a little bit longer term energy. They're used to store energy. You might remember when we looked at a carrot root or a parsnip root, we saw that the iodine turned it black because roots are a way that plants store energy for later. They store the sugar that they make for later. So they connect them all together, store that sugar for later. These are going to be things that don't taste as sugary, like potatoes, bread, grains, that kind of stuff. So let's take a look. We've got to label each one of these as a monosaccharide, a polysaccharide, or a disaccharide. So remember, mono means one, poly is many, and di is two. So the first one here, this one's made of many things. So this would be a polysaccharide, many hexagons. Number two, monosaccharide made of one hexagon. Number three, I know this one's not quite a hexagon, pretend it is. This would be a disaccharide. So what foods have carbohydrates? Go ahead and write down a couple of these. So fruits have carbohydrates, dried beans, rice, pasta, bread, potatoes. These are all foods that have carbohydrates. So the last thing we're going to do is talk about how do we test for carbohydrates. And remember we said there were two different categories of carbohydrates, simple ones made of one hexagon or two, and complex ones made of more than one. So our complex carbohydrates, you already know this one. So in order to test for starch, our complex carbohydrates or our polysaccharides, we use iodine. Remember iodine, it's this reddish orangish liquid. When it reacts with starch, it turns black. So if there's starch present, the solution's going to turn purplish black. If we don't have starch there, the solution's going to turn yellowish orange, or it's going to stay whatever color the solution was to begin with. So you can imagine, let's say I'm testing blue Kool-Aid, okay? If I add a little bit of yellowish orange into that blue Kool-Aid, it's probably still going to stay blue, or it's going to turn purplish black. How do we test for simple carbohydrates? Our simple ones made of monosaccharides or disaccharides. Again, I'm trying to make this consistent. Simple carbs, there we go. We use something called Benedict's solution or Benedict's test. It's a solution that it's a chemical we can use, and I'll show you what we do with it in a second. So I have a little video clip here, and this video clip shows us what happens when we boil test tubes that have Benedict's solution in them. So Benedict's solution's blue, but as we boil these test tubes, notice they change color. So they're actually going to change color depending on what solution they have in them, how much sugar, how much simple carbs they have. So you'll notice if it gets really red, we have a large amount of simple sugars or simple carbohydrates. Blue is the starting color of the solution. So this just means we don't have any. So if we've got simple carbs present, it's going to be green, orange, or red. And if they're absent, the solution's going to stay blue. Go ahead and pause this so you can write this down. I got 1 or 2 more slides left. So here's an example scenario. Sally crushes up some bread in a test tube. She adds iodine, and she gets the following result. She wants to know, does the bread contain starch? You'll notice it turned black. So yes, it does contain starch. She has Benedict's solution. She heats up the test tube, and then she gets the following result. Does this contain simple carbs or simple sugars? Blue is the starting color of the solution, so this does not contain simple carbs because it did not turn red, orange, or green.